Most people think attraction is obvious. They expect it to be loud, confident, and impossible to miss. But real attraction, especially the kind that leads to something stable, rarely announces itself that way. It shows up quietly in behavior that's easy to overlook if you're only watching for dramatic signals. It's not about what someone says in the moment, it's about how they manage space, timing, and attention when no one is watching. When a man is genuinely attracted, his body often reveals it before his words ever do, not through impulsive touch, but through restraint, through presence, through subtle adjustments that make an interaction feel calmer rather than more chaotic. In this talk, we're not focusing on cliches or exaggerated gestures. We're breaking down the deeper behavioral patterns, how attraction reorganizes awareness, responsibility, and connection. Because once you learn to see these patterns, you stop guessing and start understanding what real interest actually looks like. When we talk about protective touch, it's important to slow down and strip away a lot of the noise that modern culture has added to the idea of attraction. Most people think attraction announces itself loudly through bold gestures, exaggerated confidence, or physical intensity, but in reality, genuine attraction often shows up first as restraint. And restraint is not weakness, it's regulation, it's awareness, it's someone paying attention, not just to what they want, but to what's appropriate, safe, and meaningful in the moment. Protective touch sits right at the intersection of biology and values. On a biological level, when a man is attracted, his nervous system becomes more alert. He's scanning the environment more carefully. He notices potential threats, social tension, awkwardness, discomfort, sometimes before you consciously register it yourself. That heightened awareness often translates into subtle physical behaviors. A hand placed gently on the middle of your back to guide you through a crowded space. A shift in position so he's standing slightly closer to the street side when you're walking together. A quiet adjustment of proximity when someone else invades your personal space. These gestures aren't performative, they're often unconscious, and that's what makes them meaningful. They don't exist to be noticed or praised. They exist because attraction, when it's healthy, naturally activates a sense of responsibility. There's a crucial distinction here that often gets missed. Protective touch is not about ownership, it's not about control, and it's certainly not about dominance for its own sake. In fact, when touch is motivated by insecurity, it tends to become either excessive or inappropriate. Grabbing, clinging, constant contact. Those are usually signs of anxiety, not attraction. Protective touch, by contrast, is minimal. It does just enough to communicate presence and care, then it steps back. Psychologically speaking, this kind of touch signals that a man is orienting himself toward you in a future-facing way. He's not just reacting to desire in the moment. He's implicitly asking, how do I make this interaction safer, smoother, more stable? And that question matters because it reveals intent. People who are only chasing validation don't think that far ahead. They're focused inward. People who are genuinely attracted tend to think outward. There's also a philosophical dimension to this that's worth paying attention to. Responsibility is one of the clearest markers of maturity. When someone feels drawn to another person in a serious way, they instinctively begin to carry a bit more weight, not in a dramatic sense, but in small, practical ways. They take responsibility for tone, for pacing, for boundaries, for context. Protective touch is one of the earliest physical manifestations of that shift. And notice how subtle it usually is: a light hand at the elbow as you step down from a curb, a brief touch on the shoulder to get your attention before speaking quietly. These are not grand gestures, they're almost boring, but that's precisely why they're reliable. They suggest a man who is grounded enough to regulate his impulses and attentive enough to respond to what's actually happening, rather than what he wishes were happening. This is also where attraction becomes inseparable from trust. Protective touch doesn't demand trust, it earns it. It communicates without words, I'm aware of you, and I'm taking you into account. And that's deeply reassuring on a nervous system level. Humans are social animals. We're constantly reading micro signals for safety and intention. When touch is calm, measured, and situationally appropriate, it tells your body that you're not being rushed, evaluated, or pressured. Another important aspect of protective touch is timing. It almost never appears too early. When it does, it tends to feel off. If someone tries to protect before there's any real context or connection, it can come across as presumptive or performative. Genuine protective behavior emerges gradually as shared space and shared experience accumulate. It's responsive, not imposed. This is where discernment becomes important. Not every touch that looks protective actually is. Sometimes people imitate behaviors they think signal confidence or masculinity without understanding the underlying psychology. The difference is usually felt rather than seen. Protective touch feels calm. It doesn't create tension. It doesn't ask for anything in return. It doesn't linger longer than necessary, and it disappears the moment it's no longer relevant. From a developmental perspective, this kind of behavior is tied to self-regulation. A man who can regulate his emotions, impulses, and attention is far more likely to express attraction through protective touch than through overt sexualization. Why? Because his attraction isn't hijacking his behavior, it's informing it. He's still choosing how to act, and that choice is what separates meaningful attraction from impulsive desire. Desire says, I want. Attraction, at its best, says, I'm paying attention. There's also an evolutionary layer to this. Across cultures and time, one of the primary roles men have been selected for is risk management, assessing danger, responding to uncertainty, creating a buffer between vulnerability and threat. When attraction is present, that instinct often turns toward the person they're drawn to, not in a heroic, exaggerated way, but in small situational adjustments, standing closer when things feel uncertain, speaking up when someone crosses a line, offering physical guidance when the environment is chaotic. What's interesting is that these behaviors often show up before verbal commitment, before labels, before declarations. The body moves first, and if you pay attention to that, you can learn a lot about someone's intentions without having to interrogate them or read into ambiguous words. This is also why protective touch often pairs naturally with the other signals we'll talk about. Proximity, reassurance, mirroring. It's not isolated. It's part of a pattern. A man who uses protective touch but avoids emotional presence or consistency is likely acting out a role rather than responding authentically. But when protective touch appears alongside steady proximity, respectful timing, and emotional attunement, it becomes much more meaningful. There's a tendency to dismiss subtle behaviors because they don't fit the dramatic narratives we're used to. Movies teach us that attraction looks intense and immediate. Real life is quieter. Real attraction is often practical. It shows up in someone adjusting their behavior slightly, over and over again, in ways that make shared space easier rather than more charged. And here's something important. Protective touch doesn't always mean physical contact. Sometimes it's the absence of touch that's protective. Choosing not to escalate, giving you space when you seem overwhelmed, stepping back rather than pushing forward. That restraint is often the clearest signal of respect and genuine interest. If you're trying to understand whether someone is attracted to you in a grounded, meaningful way, watch how they handle moments of mild discomfort or uncertainty. Do they become impatient or do they slow things down? Do they push or do they stabilize? Do they focus on themselves or do they quietly adjust to support the interaction? Those moments reveal far more than rehearsed compliments or bold moves ever could. Protective touch, when it's real, isn't about claiming space, it's about creating it. It creates room for trust, for comfort, for conversation to deepen naturally. And that's why it tends to feel calm rather than exciting. But calm is not boring. Calm is what allows things to grow. As you move through interactions, it's worth asking yourself not just whether someone is touching you, but why. Is the touch serving the moment or serving their ego? Is it reducing tension or creating it? Is it responsive or imposed? Those distinctions matter because they point you toward patterns of behavior that either lead to stability or to confusion. Attraction that's worth paying attention to doesn't overwhelm your nervous system. It settles it. It makes you feel slightly more grounded, slightly more at ease, slightly more present. Protective touch is one of the earliest physical signals of that effect. And if there's one thing to take away from this, it's this: pay attention to the small, unremarkable moments. Attraction reveals itself not in how loudly someone wants you, but in how carefully they handle your presence. When we talk about proximity and presence, we're really talking about one of the most honest signals of attraction because it's difficult to fake over time. Words can be rehearsed, gestures can be exaggerated. But where someone places their body, how long they remain engaged, and how consistently they choose to be near you, those things tend to reveal motivation without much conscious filtering. Attraction naturally reorganizes attention. When a man is genuinely drawn to someone, his focus narrows in a very specific way. He becomes less scattered, less distracted by the room, less interested in scanning for alternatives. His body follows his attention. He leans in when you speak. He orients his torso toward you rather than away. He closes small gaps in space without making a production out of it. And importantly, he stays. That last part matters more than most people realize. Presence isn't just about moving closer, it's about remaining available. Anyone can step closer for a moment. What's revealing is who lingers, who continues to invest attention even when there's no immediate reward for doing so. Psychologically, proximity reduces uncertainty. We don't sit close to people we don't want to engage with. We create distance when we're disinterested, uncomfortable, or guarding ourselves. So when a man consistently chooses closeness, sitting beside you rather than across the room, positioning himself within conversational range, adjusting his pace to match yours, it signals a willingness to share psychological space, not just physical space. This kind of closeness tends to be understated. It doesn't rush, it doesn't invade, it feels natural because it emerges gradually, often without either person explicitly deciding anything. You start a conversation standing a few feet apart, and 10 minutes later you realize the distance has quietly disappeared. That's not accidental. It's attraction guiding behavior through comfort rather than force. There's also an important difference between proximity driven by confidence and proximity driven by anxiety. Anxious closeness often feels restless. Someone shifts too much, moves in and out of space, stands close but doesn't settle. Confident proximity, by contrast, is calm. The body relaxes. Movements slow down. There's no urgency to escalate or retreat. It's steady. Presence works the same way. A man who is attracted doesn't just show up physically, he shows up mentally. He listens without scanning his phone. He remembers details without making a point of it. He responds to what you actually say, not what he assumes you mean. That level of attention is costly. It requires energy. People don't give it away casually. Philosophically, presence is a form of respect. To be present with someone is to treat them as real and worthy of attention in the moment. Action deepens that instinct. You're no longer just another person in the environment, you become a focal point. And that shift is often visible long before it's verbalized. There's something almost grounding about being around someone who's fully present. Time feels slightly different. Conversations stretch instead of fragment. Silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward. These are not dramatic signs, but they're reliable ones. They tell you that the interaction isn't being treated as disposable. From a behavioral standpoint, proximity and presence often show up together in subtle adjustments. He times his movements to align with yours. If you slow down, he slows down. If you pause, he waits rather than filling the space with nervous chatter. That synchronization isn't strategic, it's responsive. It reflects an unconscious desire to stay connected to the rhythm of the interaction. And this is where attraction becomes less about intensity and more about alignment. Strong attraction doesn't necessarily make someone louder or bolder. Often it makes them quieter and more attentive. They don't want to disrupt what's forming. They want to maintain it. There's also a social risk involved in choosing proximity. Sitting close to someone, orienting toward them, investing sustained attention. These actions communicate interest not just to you, but to others. People who are ambivalent tend to keep their distance precisely because distance preserves ambiguity. Proximity, especially consistent proximity, reduces plausible deniability. It says, I'm choosing this interaction. That choice becomes even more meaningful in group settings. Watch where someone positions themselves when there are multiple options. Do they drift toward you without making a scene? Do they consistently end up next to you even when the group rearranges? Those patterns are rarely accidental. Presence also reveals itself in how someone handles interruptions. If a man is attracted, he'll often return to the conversation after being pulled away. He'll reestablish connection rather than letting it dissolve. That effort is a form of investment. It shows that the interaction has continuity in his mind, not just momentary appeal. There's a deeper psychological layer here as well. Human beings regulate their nervous systems through proximity. We feel calmer when we're near people we trust or feel drawn to. Attraction increases the desire for that regulation. Being close feels stabilizing rather than overstimulating. And that's why genuine attraction often feels surprisingly calm. This is important because many people confuse attraction with excitement or nervousness. Those can be present, especially early on, but they're not the core signal. The core signal is ease, a sense that being near someone makes things simpler, not more chaotic. Proximity driven by attraction tends to reduce internal noise. It's also worth noting what doesn't happen. When a man is attracted in a grounded way, he doesn't constantly test boundaries through closeness. He doesn't need to see how far he can push. He's content to remain where the connection feels mutual. That patience is telling. Presence, in this sense, is an ethical stance as much as a behavioral one. It reflects a willingness to meet someone where they are rather than trying to extract something from the interaction. That's why it pairs naturally with the protective and reassuring behaviors we discussed earlier. All of them point toward the same underlying orientation, attention directed outward rather than inward. If you were trying to interpret these signals, it helps to watch what happens when nothing is happening, when there's no obvious reason to be close, no dramatic moment, no heightened emotion. Does he still choose proximity? Does he remain present when the interaction is ordinary? Ordinary moments are where real attraction lives. Anyone can perform interest during high points. Sustained presence during neutral moments is harder to fake and more revealing. And just as with protective touch, absence can be informative. If proximity only appears when there's something to gain and disappears when things slow down, that's not attraction, it's opportunism. Genuine interest maintains a baseline level of closeness, even when the situation doesn't demand it. There's also a temporal aspect to this. Attraction reorganizes not just space, but time. Someone who's drawn to you will often extend interactions rather than shorten them. Conversations run a little longer. Goodbyes take a bit more time. There's a reluctance to end the shared moment. That extension isn't dramatic, it's subtle, but it's consistent. And consistency is the key word here. Proximity once means very little. Proximity over time forms a pattern. And patterns are what you should trust, not isolated moments. As you become more aware of these dynamics, the goal isn't to analyze every movement or read hidden meanings into normal behavior. It's simply to notice where energy goes. Attention, time, space, these are limited resources. People allocate them according to what matters. Attraction shows itself in those allocations long before it announces itself verbally. So if you're looking for clarity, don't ask how intense the interaction feels. Ask how stable it feels. Ask whether the closeness is calm, consistent, and reciprocal. Ask whether presence feels like pressure or like permission to relax, because in the end, attraction that's worth building on doesn't demand your attention. It earns it by staying. When we talk about reassuring contact, we're really talking about one of the most emotionally revealing forms of touch because it sits right on the boundary between physical and psychological connection. It's not dramatic. It doesn't demand attention. And precisely because of that, it often gets overlooked or misunderstood. But if you pay close attention, reassuring contact tells you a great deal about how someone relates to you internally. Reassuring contact usually appears in moments that matter emotionally, not theatrically. It's a light touch on the arm during a serious conversation, a brief hand on the shoulder when you're explaining something personal, a subtle contact that coincides with listening rather than speaking, and that timing is crucial. This kind of touch isn't about interrupting or escalating, it's about supporting what's already happening. Psychologically, reassurance is about regulation. Human beings are constantly regulating their emotional states in response to social cues. When a man is genuinely attracted and emotionally attuned, he becomes more sensitive to shifts in mood, tone, and vulnerability. Reassuring contact often emerges as a response to those shifts. It's the body saying, "I'm here with you," without pulling the conversation away from its substance. This is where attraction moves beyond interest and into empathy. Anyone can feel drawn to another person. Fewer people can stay present when vulnerability appears. Reassuring contact tends to show up when someone is listening carefully enough to recognize that a moment needs steadiness rather than excitement. There's also an important restraint embedded in this behavior. Reassuring contact is brief by nature. It doesn't linger. It doesn't turn into something else. It arrives, does its job, and then disappears. That brevity signals respect for boundaries and awareness of context. It says, "I'm not here to take over this moment. I'm here to support it." From a philosophical standpoint, reassurance is an act of acknowledgement. It recognizes the reality of another person's internal state, without trying to fix it, dominate it, or redirect it. That's not a small thing. In a culture that often treats emotional expression as something to solve or avoid, simple acknowledgement can feel profoundly grounding. This kind of contact often accompanies deep listening, and deep listening is costly. It requires someone to suspend their own agenda long enough to track what another person is experiencing. When attraction is shallow, attention drifts quickly back to the self. When attraction is meaningful, attention stays outward longer. That's why reassuring contact often feels calming rather than exciting. It doesn't spike adrenaline, it lowers it. And that's an important distinction. Excitement has its place, but reassurance builds trust. It tells your nervous system that you're not being evaluated or rushed. You're being met. There's also a developmental layer here. People who are emotionally mature tend to use reassurance naturally because they're comfortable with emotional nuance. They don't panic when conversations become serious. They don't need to lighten the mood or escape discomfort immediately. Reassuring contact reflects that tolerance. It shows an ability to sit with complexity without trying to override it. And again, what doesn't happen is just as important as what does. Reassuring contact doesn't show up as constant touching, fidgeting, or physical reassurance that feels performative. When touch becomes excessive, it often signals anxiety rather than care. Reassuring contact, by contrast, is minimal and precise. It responds to a moment rather than imposing itself onto one. This precision is often unconscious. Most people don't plan to reassure someone physically. They feel the moment and their body responds. That spontaneity is what makes it meaningful. It's aligned with the emotional reality of the interaction, not with a script. From an attachment perspective, reassuring contact is closely tied to secure behavior. Secure individuals are comfortable offering support without fearing rejection or needing immediate validation in return. They don't escalate reassurance into control. They trust that small gestures are enough. That trust is felt, and it changes how interactions unfold. When someone offers reassurance without expectation, it creates space for honesty. It allows conversations to deepen organically rather than defensively. There's also a strong ethical component to this kind of touch. Ethical behavior isn't just about avoiding harm, it's about acting appropriately within context. Reassuring contact respects timing, environment, and emotional tone. It doesn't blur lines or create confusion, it clarifies. This is especially noticeable in moments of uncertainty. If you're expressing doubt, stress, or hesitation, and someone responds with calm presence and minimal contact rather than persuasion or pressure, that's a strong signal of genuine attraction grounded in respect. It's also worth noting that reassurance can be expressed through stillness. Sometimes the most reassuring thing someone can do is not move at all, maintaining proximity, maintaining eye contact, staying engaged. Physical touch is just one expression of reassurance, and often it works best when paired with emotional steadiness. And this connects directly to the other signals we've discussed. Protective touch manages the environment. Proximity and presence manage space and attention. Reassuring contact manages emotion. Together, they form a coherent pattern of attraction that's oriented towards stability rather than consumption. This is why reassuring contact tends to feel safe rather than charged. It doesn't blur intention. It doesn't create pressure to respond or reciprocate immediately. It leaves room for choice. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that reassuring contact often appears at moments when someone could have said something but chose not to. Instead of interrupting with advice or commentary, they offer a brief physical signal of support and let you continue. That restraint is a form of respect. It also reveals patience. Attraction that lacks patience tends to push conversations toward outcomes. Attraction with patience allows conversations to unfold. Reassuring contact supports unfolding rather than steering, and over time, these small moments accumulate. One brief touch doesn't mean much on its own, but repeated, appropriate reassurance builds a sense of reliability. It teaches your nervous system what to expect, and reliability is one of the strongest foundations for trust. This is why you should pay attention to how someone responds when you're not at your best. Are they still present? Do they offer steadiness rather than solutions? Do they allow the moment to be what it is? Attraction that's worth investing in doesn't disappear. When things become emotionally complex, it adapts, it softens, it steadies. And that's the deeper point here. Reassuring contact isn't about signaling desire. It's about signaling care. Desire can exist without care. Care when it's genuine, almost always involves attraction that has depth. So if you want to understand whether someone's interest is grounded or superficial, watch how they handle vulnerability, yours and their own. Watch whether their presence calms or agitates. Watch whether their touch clarifies or confuses, because in the end, the most meaningful connections aren't built through intensity, they're built through moments of quiet reassurance that say, without words, you're not alone in this moment. When we talk about mirroring and timing, we're talking about one of the most quietly revealing signals of attraction, because it operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness. People rarely decide to mirror someone. They don't plan it. It happens because attention has narrowed and alignment has begun. And alignment is one of the clearest indicators that attraction has moved beyond surface interest into something more integrated. Mirroring shows up when two people start sharing rhythm. Posture shifts begin to match, speech patterns subtly align. One person pauses and the other pauses too. One leans back and the other follows a moment later. Even breathing can synchronize. None of this is deliberate. In fact, the more deliberate someone tries to be, the less natural it feels. Genuine mirroring is spontaneous, almost invisible unless you know to look for it. Psychologically, mirroring is a form of attunement. It means someone is tracking you closely enough that their body begins to respond before their mind catches up. Their attention isn't divided. They're not half present. They're engaged in a way that allows their nervous system to adjust to yours. This is important because attraction that stays shallow tends to remain performative. People act, they present, they manage impressions. But when attraction deepens, management decreases and responsiveness increases. Mirroring is responsiveness made visible. Timing works the same way. An attracted man doesn't rush moments that are still forming. He senses when to speak and when to stay quiet. He doesn't interrupt important pauses. He doesn't push conversations forward before they're ready. That sensitivity to timing isn't about strategy. It's about perception. From a philosophical perspective, timing is a form of respect for reality. It acknowledges that not everything should happen immediately, even if desire is present. Good timing means recognizing the difference between opportunity and impatience. And that distinction tells you a great deal about someone's internal state. People who are insecure tend to rush. They fear losing momentum. They fear silence. They fear ambiguity. So they fill space too quickly, touch too soon, escalate too fast. People who are grounded trust the process. They allow moments to breathe. They understand that connection isn't fragile. It strengthens when it's not forced. Mirroring and timing often work together. When someone mirrors you, they're not just copying your movements. They're matching your pace. If you're speaking slowly, they slow down. If you're thoughtful, they become thoughtful. That matching creates a sense of being met rather than chased or led. This is where attraction begins, to feel collaborative rather than directional. No one is pulling, no one is pushing. Both people are adjusting, slightly again and again, until a shared rhythm emerges, and shared rhythm is one of the strongest predictors of emotional compatibility. There's also a neurological basis for this. Mirror neurons are activated when we observe and emotionally resonate with others. When attraction is present, these systems become more active. We literally begin to experience the other person's behavior as something to align with rather than something to evaluate. That alignment feels good because it reduces friction. Interactions become smoother. Less effort is required to stay connected. And that ease is often misinterpreted as chemistry or fate when it's actually attentiveness expressed through behavior. Timing, in particular, reveals patience. A man who is genuinely attracted doesn't need to rush physical or emotional escalation to prove interest. He's willing to wait because waiting doesn't feel like loss. It feels like investment. He trusts that if the connection is real, it will continue to develop without being forced. This shows up in small ways. He waits for you to finish your thought rather than cutting in. He allows silence without trying to fix it. He senses when a moment is playful and when it's serious, and he adjusts accordingly. Those adjustments are subtle, but they're consistent, and consistency matters. Anyone can get timing right once. What reveals attraction is getting it right repeatedly across different contexts, moods, and environments. That takes attention, and attention is not something people give freely unless they're genuinely engaged. There's also something deeply ethical about good timing. It respects autonomy. It doesn't pressure someone into responding before they're ready. It allows choice to remain intact. That's why interactions with good timing tend to feel safe rather than manipulative. Mirroring, too, has an ethical dimension. When it's unconscious and responsive, it communicates understanding. When it's exaggerated or forced, it feels mocking or insincere. Again, the difference is felt more than seen. Natural mirroring feels smooth. Forced mirroring feels off. And his brings us back to an important theme running through all of these signals. Attraction that has depth tends to reduce tension, not increase it. Mirroring and good timing make interactions feel less effortful. They remove unnecessary friction. They create a sense that you're not having to perform to be understood. It's also worth noticing how mirroring changes over time. Early on, it may be subtle, small posture shifts matching tone. As connection grows, it often becomes more pronounced but still unspoken. Shared humor develops. Shared pauses feel natural. You start anticipating each other's rhythms. This anticipation isn't control, it's familiarity. And familiarity is not the enemy of attraction when it's grounded in respect. It's often what allows attraction to deepen into something sustainable. Poor timing, by contrast, creates confusion. Touch that comes too early. Intensity that arrives before trust. Words that escalate faster than behavior can support. These mismatches strain the interaction because they force you to respond to something you didn't invite. Mirroring and timing help prevent that strain. They keep interaction proportional. They ensure that what's offered matches what's been built so far. And that proportionality is one of the clearest indicators of emotional intelligence. If you want to observe this in real time, pay attention to moments of transition. When a conversation shifts topics, when a setting changes, when emotion deepens or lightens. Does he adjust smoothly, or does he lag behind or rush ahead? Smooth adjustment signals attunement. And attunement is not just about attraction, it's about capacity for relationship. Someone who can't track timing and rhythm in small interactions will struggle to do so in larger ones. These micro signals scale. That's why it's worth taking them seriously, not obsessively, but attentively. You're not looking for perfection, you're looking for patterns of responsiveness. Attraction that's worth trusting doesn't feel chaotic, it feels coherent. Mirroring and timing contribute to that coherence by aligning behavior with moment, context, and emotional tone. And here's the key insight to leave with. Real attraction doesn't override awareness, it sharpens it. It makes someone more sensitive to you, not less. More patient, not more impulsive. More aligned, not more intrusive. So as you move forward, notice who moves with you rather than toward you. Notice who respects the pace of the moment rather than trying to control it. Notice who listens with their body as much as their words. Because the deepest signal of attraction isn't intensity, it's attunement.